Fiona ran barefoot into the nursery, candlelight trembling in her hand, and found little Adrien curled against the bedpost, shaking violently beneath his sheets. "She was here," he cried, voice quivering. "Miriam was here, standing right there by the window." The maid's heart clenched. The curtains swayed, but the room was empty. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "It was only a dream." But he shook his head, sobbing harder. "She said Father hates me, that his enemies will come for me, and that my mother sold me for gold." Fiona froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Those words, those cruel lies, were eating at his soul. "Who told you that, Adrien?" "That's all lies," she said softly. "Miriam," he whispered. "She told me." He buried his face against her chest, still crying as she stroked his hair and murmured, "You're safe now. You're safe. It was just a dream, okay? No one will hurt you again. Not while I'm here." From the doorway, unseen, the Duke of Blackridge stood, his shadow trembling like the storm behind him. The boy's fear was a mirror of his own sins. And the maid? She held his son as if he were her heartbeat. He didn't know yet who she truly was. Only that, for the first time in years, someone else could quiet his child's cries.
The rain did not fall, it roared. It lashed against the carriage windows like a beast trying to claw its way in, drowning the sound of the driver's whip and the groaning wheels as they climbed the steep, cobbled road to Castle Blackridge. Thunder rolled low across the sky, echoing through the valley like the growl of something ancient. Inside the carriage, Fiona sat rigid, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Each flash of lightning illuminated her reflection, wide eyes, damp curls escaping beneath her bonnet, lips pressed to still the tremor that wanted to escape. She had heard the rumours long before she agreed to come. "The Duke's child is cursed," they said. "No maid lasts a week. The castle itself swallows the kind-hearted whole." Yet, here she was. When the carriage stopped at last before the iron gates, Fiona stepped out into the storm. Wind tore at her cloak, plastering it to her frame as she looked up at the looming fortress. The torches lining the walls sputtered in protest, their flames bending sideways under the wind. Beyond them, tall windows glowed faintly, like eyes watching her arrival. The guard at the gate barely glanced up. "Name?" "Fiona," she answered, her voice small against the wind. "I was sent from the agency in Fairhaven." He nodded, muttered something to the other watchman, and pulled open the heavy gate. It groaned like an old thing remembering pain. Fiona drew a steadying breath and crossed the threshold. Inside, the air changed, colder, heavier. The echo of her footsteps on the stone floor followed her as she entered the grand hall. Portraits of grim-faced nobles lined the walls, their painted eyes unblinking. At the far end, a staircase rose like a spine into the upper floors, vanishing into shadow. A woman in grey, the head housekeeper, by the look of her apron and keys, appeared from the side corridor. Her expression was polite but wary. "The Duke prefers silence," she said briskly. "No idle chatter. You will be assigned to the nursery." "The nursery?" Fiona repeated softly. The woman nodded. "The child is delicate, easily frightened. You will find him different." Fiona only inclined her head, her heart already beating faster. The halls stretched endlessly, each corridor colder than the last. The storm outside raged, but in here it was unnervingly still, no laughter, no conversation, just the distant drip of rainwater and the whisper of her own footsteps. When they reached the nursery door, the housekeeper hesitated. Her hand hovered over the latch before pulling back. "He doesn't take kindly to strangers," she said in a lower voice. "Most who come don't last beyond the second day. You'll see for yourself." Fiona took a quiet breath. "I'll manage." The latch clicked. The door creaked open. The room was dim, curtains drawn tight, a single candle guttering on the mantel. Toys lay scattered, untouched, and the scent of lavender lingered faintly, as though someone had tried to disguise the smell of fear. In the corner, Half hidden behind a small chair sat a boy. He couldn't have been more than 6, pale, fragile, clutching a wooden horse so tightly his knuckles blanched. His shoulders trembled with each breath. Fiona froze, her heart twisting. "Adrien?" she asked softly. The boy flinched at his name, shrinking deeper into the corner. "It's all right," she said quickly, lowering herself to her knees. "I didn't mean to frighten you." No answer, only the sound of rain against the windows. She stayed where she was, letting the silence stretch until it stopped feeling dangerous. Then, slowly, she reached for one of the fallen toys, a small fabric rabbit with one ear missing, and set it gently on the floor. "When I was your age," she murmured, "I had a rabbit just like this. His name was Clover. He was brave when I wasn't." Still nothing. But the boy's eyes flicked briefly toward her, curious despite himself. Fiona smiled faintly. "Clover used to listen when the thunder scared me. I'd tell him it was just the clouds playing drums." She tilted her head toward the window as another rumble rolled overhead. "They're not very good at it, are they?" A tiny sound escaped the boy, not quite a laugh, but close. Fiona's breath caught. Carefully, she inched closer until she was sitting a few feet away. "Would you like me to tell you a secret?" she whispered. He didn't move, but she saw the faintest nod, so she began to hum. A soft tune, old and gentle, the kind mothers once sang to their children before the world learned how to break them. The melody filled the room, wrapping around the thunder's growl. The boy's grip on the wooden horse loosened, his trembling slowed. When lightning flashed across the window, he didn't flinch. Fiona smiled, continuing to hum until the candle steadied. "Better?" she asked quietly. Adrien blinked, his small voice barely there. "Who are you?" "Just someone who came to help you sleep," she answered. "You can call me Fiona." His gaze lingered on her face, cautious, uncertain, but no longer terrified. For the first time since she'd entered, Fiona exhaled fully. Behind her, the door creaked. She turned sharply and froze. In the doorway stood a tall figure, half lit by the candle's glow. His dark hair framed a face carved from restraint. Sharp cheekbones, unreadable eyes, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. The black of his coat melted into the shadows behind him, making him seem almost part of the castle itself. The servants' whispers came flooding back. The Duke of Blackridge. He said nothing. His gaze moved from the maid, kneeling on the floor, to the boy sitting calmly for the first time in months. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile, more like disbelief wrapped in awe. Fiona rose slowly, bowing her head. "Your Grace." He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on his son, at the stillness that had replaced years of trembling. Adrien looked up at him, uncertain, then back at Fiona. His small hand reached for hers again. The Duke's jaw tightened, emotion flickering behind the frost. He had seen healers, tutors, governesses, all had failed. But now, in this quiet moment, the impossible had happened. His son was calm. The candlelight caught the faint tremor in his breath as he stepped closer. "Continue," he said softly. His voice was low, restrained, but beneath it, something human stirred. Fiona nodded, kneeling once more beside the boy. Her voice found the melody again, filling the nursery with warmth. From the doorway, Duke Gavin Blackridge watched, motionless, silent, as thunder rolled outside and the storm began to fade. For the first time in years, his heart felt something dangerously close to peace. Would you have dared take this job in the Duke's haunted halls, knowing every maid before you fled in fear? Tell me in the comments below. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Castle Blackridge wrapped in a shroud of mist. The stone corridors gleamed with dampness, the scent of rain still clinging to the air. Somewhere deep within the castle, a single clock tolled 8 times, its echo lingering like a warning. Fiona adjusted her apron and followed the narrow hall that led to the nursery. Her footsteps were soft, careful. The memory of last night, the trembling boy, The Duke's silent watch from the doorway still lingered in her chest like an unspoken question. She wasn't sure what had startled her more, the boy's fear or the quiet intensity of the man who ruled this house. When she entered the nursery, the fire had burned low. Adrien sat by the window, clutching the same wooden horse she'd seen before. Pale morning light streamed through the glass, but he'd drawn his knees close and turned his face away from it, as though sunlight itself hurt him. "Good morning, Adrien," she said softly. No reply. His small shoulders stiffened at her voice. Fiona crossed the room, keeping her tone gentle, unhurried. "You needn't hide from the day. The sun can't harm you here." He gave the faintest shake of his head. "It's too bright," he whispered, almost inaudible. She paused, startled that he'd spoken at all. "Too bright?" He nodded again, eyes still averted. Fiona crouched beside him, careful not to reach out. "Would it help if we drew the curtains halfway instead of shutting them completely? That way, the sun can peek in without being too bold." After a moment, he nodded once more. She smiled gently and pulled the heavy drapes back just enough for a sliver of gold to spill across the floor. It touched his shoes, his knees, and slowly crept toward his hands. Adrien watched the light with wary fascination, like a creature unsure whether it was warmth or danger. She didn't speak again. Silence, she was learning, was the language he understood best. A quiet knock sounded behind her. The door opened just enough for the head housekeeper, Mrs. Hensley, to step in. Her expression was grim, her grey hair bound tightly at her nape. "You're with him already," she said, voice hushed as though afraid to disturb the walls themselves. "That's good. The Duke, he prefers progress." Fiona straightened, glancing between her and the boy. "What kind of progress, ma'am?" Mrs. Hensley hesitated, then shut the door behind her. "The kind that can be seen, not felt," she muttered. "He wants the child steady, silent, obedient, as if children are soldiers to be drilled." Fiona frowned. "The Duke wants his son afraid of him?" "Not afraid," the older woman said bitterly. "Just respectful. But there's a difference between respect and terror, isn't there?" Fiona nodded, her gaze drifting to the boy again. Adrien had turned slightly, pretending not to listen, but his fingers twisted in the mane of his wooden horse until the paint began to chip. Mrs. Hensley lowered her voice. "It wasn't always like this. When he was a baby, he used to laugh. He used to follow people around with those big grey eyes. But that changed after the first maid left." Fiona's pulse quickened. "The first maid?" The woman's eyes darkened. "Miriam, she stayed with him until his 3rd year. No one ever questioned her because she came recommended by the Duke's mother herself. But she was cruel, that one, cold and sharp, the kind who smiles when no one's looking." A flicker of something, anger or dread, crossed Fiona's face. "Cruel? How?" Mrs. Hensley's gaze darted toward the door. "She didn't strike him, not that we saw, but words can bruise deeper than hands, can't they? She'd whisper things to him when the Duke was away, tell him he was unwanted, that his mother was a ghost who never loved him. He'd cry in silence, because no one dared interrupt her." Fiona felt her stomach twist. "And no one stopped her." "I tried," Mrs. Hensley confessed, wringing her hands. "But who am I to the Duke? He doesn't take counsel from servants. When I mentioned it once, he looked at me as though I'd insulted the walls themselves." Adrien turned suddenly, his eyes wide. "She used to sing too," he said softly. "But not like you." Fiona blinked, caught off guard. "Miriam sang to you?" He nodded slowly. "When Father wasn't here, she'd hum and say she was the only one who cared. Then she'd laugh when I cried." Mrs. Hensley's expression faltered. "Poor child." Fiona knelt again, her voice trembling but calm. "You don't have to remember her anymore, Adrien. She's not here now. You're safe." He looked at her as though testing the truth in her words. After a long silence, he whispered, "Are you going to leave too?" The question hit her like a blow. "No," she said firmly. "Not until you stop being afraid of the sun." For a moment, She thought she saw the faintest smile ghost across his lips. The door creaked open again and both women straightened instantly. Duke Gavin stepped into the nursery. His presence filled the space, cold and composed, a man carved from authority. He wore black again, he always did, his gloves tucked beneath one arm. "Mrs. Hensley," he said curtly, "you may leave us." The housekeeper bobbed a quick curtsy and fled without a word. The Duke's gaze then turned to Fiona and the boy. Adrien's hands tightened on his wooden horse. Fiona felt his fear ripple beside her and spoke quickly. "We were only speaking softly, Your Grace. He's doing well this morning." The Duke's eyes flicked toward his son, who had turned his face to the floor. "Define well," he said flatly. Fiona drew in a slow breath, measuring her tone. "He's speaking, responding. That's progress." "Progress," Gavin repeated, as though testing the word. "I've seen him shatter glass and tear his clothes. If you believe a few whispers count as progress, perhaps you misunderstand your purpose." Fiona met his gaze evenly. "Fear can't be commanded, Your Grace. It must be soothed." The room stilled. Even the fire seemed to pause its crackling. Gavin's eyes, a shade of grey, colder than stone, studied her. No one in this house spoke to him like that, not since his wife had died, before even becoming one in name. Yet this maid, this quiet woman with steady hands, dared to correct him. His jaw tightened. "You speak boldly for someone who's been here less than a day." "Perhaps boldness is what he needs," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. He took a step closer, his shadow falling across her. "What he needs," he said, "is discipline, not sentiment." Fiona rose, unwilling to shrink back. "Then you misunderstand him too." The silence stretched between them, sharp as a blade. Gavin's gaze dropped to his son, who was watching them both now with wide, uncertain eyes. For the first time, the Duke seemed to hesitate. His voice, when it came, was quieter. "If he speaks again, inform me immediately." He turned to leave, but something in Fiona's tone stopped him. "He already has." Gavin paused at the door. "What did he say?" "That he's afraid of the sun," Fiona replied softly, "and that someone once told him his mother was a ghost." The Duke's hand froze on the doorframe. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then, without turning back, he left the room. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving only the sound of the fire and the boy's quiet breathing. Fiona knelt again beside Adrien and whispered, "It's all right. You can look at the light now." This time he didn't hide his face. He lifted his eyes toward the faint patch of sunlight on the floor and whispered, "It's not so bright anymore." She smiled through the ache in her chest. "No," she said softly. "It isn't." From the corridor beyond, unseen, Gavin paused for a moment longer than he should have. One gloved hand pressed against the wall, his thoughts a storm of guilt and confusion. For the first time in years, something in him shifted, uneasy, unfamiliar, but undeniably alive. The nights in Castle Blackridge were long and heavy, filled with the kind of silence that swallowed sound. Once the sun disappeared behind the cliffs, even the servants moved like ghosts, whispering only when necessary. The Duke liked it that way, or at least he thought he did. But lately something about the silence unsettled him. Gavin found himself awake more often, walking the corridors with a candle in hand, unable to rest. Each night his steps led him inevitably toward the nursery. He told himself it was duty, that he needed to ensure the new maid hadn't undone the fragile progress of the first day, yet he knew better. There was something about her presence that pulled him from his study, something he didn't quite understand. That evening, as he approached the half-open nursery door, a soft sound reached him, low, steady, rhythmic. A voice. He stopped. The flicker of candlelight spilled from within, and the faint murmur of a woman reading drifted into the corridor. Her tone rose and fell like music. For the first time in years, the sound of peace filled that room. He stepped closer, quiet as shadow. Inside, Fiona sat on the floor beside Adrien's bed, her posture easy, the book open across her knees. The boy was lying on his stomach, chin in his hands, following her finger as she traced the lines across the page. "Try again," she whispered. Adrien frowned, his small lips moving as he sounded out the letters. Castle. "Good," she said, her smile faint but real. "Now the next one." He hesitated, glancing at her, searching her expression for judgment. Finding none, he whispered, Garden." Her eyes softened. "Perfect." And then, quietly, unexpectedly, Adrien laughed. The sound was small, rough from disuse, but it echoed through the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Fiona's smile widened, and she laughed too, a warm human sound that filled every shadow. From the doorway, Gavin froze. He hadn't heard that sound, his son's laughter, since the child's first year, before the house had gone still, before Miriam's cold whispers had poisoned the air. For years he had believed the boy incapable of it. Yet now, in a single moment, this woman had done what no doctor, no tutor, no command could accomplish. He didn't step inside. He couldn't. His chest felt tight, something twisting painfully inside him as he watched. "Why do you like reading?" Adrien asked suddenly. Fiona thought for a moment, then answered softly, "Because stories remind us that even when the world is cruel, people can still choose to be kind." The boy nodded as though he understood more than his years should allow. He turned another page, his small finger resting on the illustration of a bird breaking free from a cage. "Do you think I could fly one day?" he asked. Fiona's voice broke into a whisper. "You already are." The Duke's grip on the doorframe tightened until the wood creaked. He turned away before they could notice him and walked the length of the corridor, his candlelight trembling against the walls. He didn't understand the feeling clawing at his chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't envy. It was something far more dangerous, something that made him ache. The next morning he summoned Mrs. Hensley under the pretense of casual inquiry. "The new maid?" he said, not looking up from his desk. "How fares her work?" The housekeeper folded her hands. "Exceptional, Your Grace. The boy eats with her, sleeps without crying. The staff whisper that she's bewitched him." Gavin's brow lifted. "Do you believe that?" "No, Your Grace. I believe she cares." He looked up then sharply. "Cares?" Mrs. Hensley hesitated. "Yes, it's a rare thing in these walls." Gavin waved her off, but her words lingered long after she was gone. That night, he passed the nursery again. This time the door was open wider and he didn't stop himself from entering. Fiona looked up briefly, startled, but he gestured for her to continue. She returned her attention to Adrien, who was tracing letters across a slate. "What's that?" Gavin asked, his tone even, controlled. "His name, Your Grace," Fiona answered, her hand steady as she guided the boy's small fingers. "He's learning to write it." "After all this time?" Gavin's voice was softer now, curious instead of cold. Fiona looked at him then, really looked at him, and said, "Fear makes learning difficult. Once fear fades, understanding returns." Her words struck deeper than she knew. He didn't reply. Adrien finished scrawling the last letter and looked up shyly. "Did I do it right?" Gavin hesitated, then crouched beside the table. The boy flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Gavin studied the uneven letters and said quietly, "It's perfect." Adrien blinked, uncertain, as if unsure whether to believe him. Then, for the first time, the boy smiled briefly at his father. Fiona saw it and quickly turned away, pretending to tidy the books. But her chest ached. When Gavin stood, his eyes lingered on her. There was something unreadable in his expression, curiosity mixed with gratitude, and beneath it a loneliness so profound it nearly mirrored her own. "Continue your work," he said, his voice lower now. "You have my approval." She bowed her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." He left before his composure could falter, but sleep did not come easily to him after that. The next evening, restless once more, He took a book from his study and wandered the corridors until he found himself again before the nursery door. He told himself it was coincidence, but even he didn't believe it. Inside, Fiona sat by the hearth, reading softly as Adrien dozed in her lap. Her hair had come loose from its pins, a few curls resting against her cheek. The firelight played across her face, gentle and golden. He should have left, but he didn't. He stood there, just beyond sight, listening to the cadence of her voice. When she closed the book and began to hum the same lullaby he had once heard in his dreams, his heart clenched. He didn't know why it felt familiar, why it stirred something buried long ago. He stepped back into the shadow, his pulse uneven. And then softly, he heard her whisper, "You are loved more than you know, Adrien. Always remember that." Her words hung in the air like a prayer. Gavin's breath caught. For years he had told himself love was a weakness, a luxury that belonged to those with nothing else to lose. But in that single sentence, spoken with such quiet conviction, everything inside him shifted. He turned away, his footsteps soundless on the stone floor. Back in his study, he set the book on his desk, but couldn't read a single line. The words on the page blurred, replaced by her voice, her calmness, the warmth that filled the cold spaces of his home. For the first time since his youth, Gavin felt unsure of himself. Not in power or title, but in something far more intimate. Something within him had awakened. Something he had long buried beneath command and control. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the weight of years pressing against his chest. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the windows like a heartbeat, and for reasons he could not explain, the Duke of Blackridge felt human. The storm arrived without warning, wild, relentless, alive. Lightning split the sky above Castle Blackridge, followed by a thunderclap so violent it rattled the glass panes in their frames. Rain lashed the windows like 1,000 desperate hands. Fiona woke to the sound of it, heart pounding. The wind screamed down the chimneys, and somewhere deep in the castle, a door slammed open and shut. She threw on her robe and hurried down the corridor, guided by the flickering glow of wall lamps. Every shadow felt alive. Then she heard it, faint, broken, a child's cry. Her feet quickened. She pushed open the nursery door just as another flash of lightning illuminated the room. Adrien sat bolt upright in bed, his small body shaking, his sheets tangled around his legs. "Adrien!" she gasped, crossing the room. He flinched at the sound of her voice, eyes wild, unfocused. "Don't let her take me," he sobbed. "Please, don't let her take me." Fiona reached him and took his face in her trembling hands. "Adrien, look at me. There's no one here. You're safe." But he shook his head violently. "She was here. She said Father doesn't want me. She said he hates me, that he'd rather I'd never been born." His words came out broken, strangled by tears. "She said his enemies will come for me, that he'll let them because he's too cold to care." The air left Fiona's lungs. Miriam's voice still haunted this child, even from memory. "Adrien," she whispered, forcing calm into her tone though her heart was breaking. "Listen to me. It was a dream." "No." He clutched her sleeve, knuckles white. "She was standing right there by the window. I saw her. She said Mother sold me for gold, that she gave me away like a dog." Fiona froze. The words hit her like shards of glass. For a moment the storm outside seemed to fade into silence, as if even the thunder held its breath. She could barely swallow past the ache in her throat. Miriam's cruelty ran deeper than she'd ever feared, its roots twisting into the very core of the boy's soul. "Adrien." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. "Look at me." He wouldn't. He curled into her, burying his face against her chest. Fiona wrapped her arms around him, holding him as tightly as she dared. She rocked him gently, the way a mother would rock a newborn, slow, steady, protective. "She lied to you," she murmured into his hair. "Every word she said was poison. Your father does not hate you. And your mother did not sell you. She loved you more than anything in this world." Lightning flared, casting white light across the walls. In that flash, Gavin stood in the doorway. He hadn't meant to intrude. The storm had driven him from sleep, and the sound of the boy's cries had drawn him instinctively down the hall. But now, as he stood there unseen, the scene before him rooted him to the spot. The maid, Fiona, held his son as though he were the most fragile thing on earth. Her hand stroked his hair, her voice trembled with an emotion he could not name. "She said father doesn't care," Adrien whimpered. Fiona's voice grew fierce, though still tender. "Your father is strict because he doesn't know how to be soft. But that doesn't mean he doesn't care. Sometimes love wears armor, Adrien. Sometimes it hides behind silence." Gavin's breath caught. He took an involuntary step forward, the floor creaking under his boot. Fiona turned sharply, startled. But when she saw him, she didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, her eyes glistening, and turned back to the boy. "It's all right," she whispered again. "You're safe, you're loved, and nothing she said can hurt you anymore." Adrien's breathing slowed, his sobs softened into hiccups. Gradually, his trembling eased. The fury of the storm outside faded to a rhythmic patter against the glass. Gavin moved closer, his voice low and uncertain. "What happened?" Fiona didn't look at him at first. Her gaze was fixed on Adrien, who had fallen back against her shoulder, eyelids heavy with exhaustion. "He woke from a nightmare," she said softly. "She was in it again." "Miriam," Gavin murmured, his jaw tightening. "Always Miriam." "She left scars," Fiona whispered. "Scars you can't see." Gavin's expression darkened. He looked at his son, then at the woman who held him so protectively. "He speaks of things he should not know," he said after a long pause. "Enemies, betrayal. How does he know of such things?" Fiona met his eyes then, her voice trembling but steady. "Because someone filled his head with them. Someone who wanted him to fear his own blood." A flash of guilt crossed the Duke's face. He had dismissed too many cries as childish fancies, too many fears as weakness. He had turned away when the boy needed him most. The weight of that realization pressed on him, heavier than any crown. He took a step closer. "You speak as if you understand that kind of fear." Fiona hesitated. "Maybe I do." "Why?" he asked quietly. "How could you?" She swallowed, eyes glistening in the candlelight. "Because fear like his doesn't come from the dark. It comes from loneliness, from feeling unwanted. I've known that kind of night before." Her voice cracked at the end, the truth in it raw and unpolished. For a long moment they stood in silence. The only sound the rain whispering against the windows. Gavin's gaze softened, confusion stirring beneath the cold surface of his composure. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask more. But Adrien stirred, and Fiona's attention returned instantly to the child. She laid him gently back onto the bed, tucking the blanket beneath his chin. "Will she come back?" Adrien mumbled sleepily. "No," she said firmly, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Not ever again." His hand found hers, small and trusting. "Promise?" "I promise." He sighed and drifted into sleep, the storm outside finally surrendering to calm. Fiona stayed beside him, her hand resting lightly over his. Her eyes shimmered in the candlelight, fierce and tender all at once. Behind her, Gavin watched quietly, 1,000 thoughts colliding in his mind. This woman, this maid, had reached his son's heart when he himself had failed. How? And more pressing still, why did her words carry the weight of lived pain as though she had once wept the same tears she now soothed? When Fiona finally looked up, their eyes met. "You should rest, Your Grace," she said softly. "The boy's dream has passed." He lingered a moment longer, his voice low. "How do you know what to say to him? How do you calm fears even I cannot name?" She hesitated, then turned away. "Because I know what it means to be haunted." Her words struck him like a gust of wind through an open window, chilling, honest, inexplicable. He watched her in silence, the firelight painting gold across her face. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "You're unlike anyone I've met, Miss Fiona." "And you," she murmured without turning, "are a father who doesn't yet know he is one." He stared at her back for a long time, unsure whether to be angered or moved. Then, quietly, he left the room. In the hall he paused, listening to the fading sound of her lullaby echoing through the nursery. Something inside him twisted again. Guilt, perhaps, or something more dangerous. That night, as lightning flared across the sky and thunder rolled over the hills, the Duke of Blackridge understood that the walls he'd built around his heart were beginning to crack. And for the first time in years, he feared what might happen if they truly broke. Do you believe words can wound deeper than any weapon or heal stronger than any medicine? Tell me what you think in the comments below. The morning after the storm arrived, grey and restless, the sky hanging low over the spires of Castle Blackridge. The scent of rain still clung to the halls, mingling with the faint smoke of dying hearths. Servants moved quietly, whispering about the cries that had echoed through the night, but none dared ask questions aloud. In the Duke's study, Gavin sat behind his desk, a letter half-written before him. The ink had long dried on the quill. He wasn't writing anymore. He was thinking. He could still hear Fiona's voice from the night before, her calm strength as she soothed his son, her quiet defiance as she spoke of love, like it was something sacred, something he had forgotten how to hold. When the knock came, he straightened. "Enter." Fiona stepped in, her steps deliberate, her face composed but shadowed by sleeplessness. "You sent for me, Your Grace?" He gestured toward the chair before him, but didn't speak until she sat. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Then, finally, he said, "My son slept through the night." "I'm glad to hear it," she said softly. Gavin leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. "You've been here for at least a week, and already you've done what years of physicians and tutors could not. I should be grateful." He paused. "But instead, I find myself unsettled." Fiona frowned faintly. "Unsettled, Your Grace?" He rose from his chair, pacing toward the window. The light from the overcast sky poured across the room, pale and cold. "You speak to my son with a familiarity that should not exist. You comfort him as though you were born to it. And last night you dared speak of love as if you knew what this house lacked." He turned sharply, his voice low but cutting. "Tell me, Miss Fiona, why are you so invested in my son's wounds?" Her breath caught, but she met his eyes without flinching. "Because those wounds were carved by cruelty, and I cannot watch him suffer." He studied her, eyes narrowing. "There is something you're not saying." She hesitated, her hands twisting together in her lap. "Your Grace," she said at last, her tone trembling with restrained fury, "that woman, Miriam, must be punished." The Duke froze. "Miriam?" "Yes," she said, rising from her chair. "The one who called herself a maid, but poisoned your son's mind. She made him afraid of the world, of you, of himself. She told him lies that no child should ever hear." Her voice shook. She should not walk free after that. His brow furrowed. "And how?" he asked slowly. "Do you know such things? Those lies were whispered years ago, spoken in shadows when even I was not present." Fiona stiffened. "Didn't you see how your son trembled last night? Isn't this enough for you to question Miriam? You're so blinded by duty you can't even feel your son's pains." "I know the sound of a child's brokenness," she said quietly, "because I can feel it when I touch his hand, when I look into his eyes." Gavin's eyes darkened, suspicion flickering beneath the surface. "That isn't an answer." Fiona's chest rose and fell. "It's the only one I have, until you demand the truth." He stepped closer, his tone sharp with command. "Then I demand it now." Silence. Fiona's gaze dropped to the floor, then lifted again, heavy with pain and resolve. "You want to know why I care so much, why I came to this house, why your son looks at me as though he's always known me?" Gavin said nothing, but his pulse quickened. She took a trembling breath. "Because I am his mother." The world seemed to still. The rain tapping at the glass became the only sound in the room. Gavin stared at her, disbelieving. "What did you say?" Her voice steadied, though tears glimmered at the corners of her eyes. "I am Adrien's mother, the woman you paid years ago to give you an heir, the one you ordered to disappear after the child was born." He blinked as though struck. The memory hit like lightning, signing the agreement, the faceless woman beneath the veil, the hurried departure before dawn. He had never looked her in the eye, never asked her name. "No," he said hoarsely. "That woman took her gold and vanished." She never looked back. Fiona's lips quivered. "That woman was desperate, Your Grace. She needed the money because her family was dying, because the world gave her no mercy. But when the gold was spent and silence replaced her child's cry, she realized she had sold her own heart." Her voice cracked. "You may have paid me to forget, but I couldn't. I tried. I built a life around the hollow ache of him, but the pain never faded." She took a small step forward, her voice trembling. "Then I heard a rumor that the Duke of Blackridge's only son was terrified of his own home, that no maid could keep him from screaming. And I knew it had to be him." Gavin stood frozen, his breath shallow. "You came here, knowing who I was." "I came because I couldn't stay away," she whispered. "I didn't even know the name of the woman who hurt him, only that my son was suffering. So I applied under another name, just to be near him. I thought if I could hold him once more, even as a stranger, perhaps it would mend what I broke." Her tears fell freely now. "You wanted a name to continue, Gavin. I wanted a child to hold." He flinched at his name from her lips, his composure fractured, his voice thick. "You lied to me." "Yes," she said softly, "and I would do it again." He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You deceived your employer, entered my home under false pretenses. Would you have allowed me in otherwise?" she asked, voice raw. "Would you have let me see him, touch him, speak to him? You made sure no one ever spoke of that arrangement again. You turned a living bond into a transaction." His fists clenched. "I did what was necessary. Duty demanded it." "Duty?" Her voice rose, shaking. "Is duty what you call abandoning a mother to her grief? Is it duty to raise a boy in fear, to teach him that love is weakness?" He turned, anger flaring, but beneath it was guilt, deep, suffocating guilt. Fiona's tone softened. "You think I came here to shame you? I didn't. I came here because that boy deserves the truth, because the only way to free him from fear is to give him what neither of us did back then, love." Gavin looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time saw not the servant, but the woman he had unknowingly ruined. A woman who had once needed gold to survive, and now risked everything for the child she never stopped loving. He sank into his chair, his voice breaking. "I thought I was doing what was right. I thought I could control what life demanded of me." "You can't control love," she whispered. "You can only destroy it, or choose it." Silence filled the room again. The light from the window caught the wet streaks on her cheeks, turning them to gold. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small. "You can punish me if you wish, send me away, but don't let Miriam go unpunished. She broke what was already fragile. She made him believe no one wanted him, not even me." Gavin rose slowly, crossing the space between them. His expression was unreadable, torn between fury and regret. "I won't send you away," he said at last. His voice was low, rough. "Not yet." Her breath hitched. "Why?" "Because I need to know how to fix what I broke," he murmured, "and it seems you're the only one who knows how." For the first time in years his voice faltered, not as a duke, not as a ruler, but as a man who had lost something he never realized he'd wanted to keep. Fiona lowered her gaze, trembling, but there was peace in her eyes too. The truth was finally spoken. Gavin looked toward the window, where sunlight cut through the clouds, pale and new. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't rage. It wasn't control. It was the weight of realization and the faint trembling beginning of redemption. The castle seemed larger now, emptier, colder, as though her confession had hollowed it from the inside. The corridors that once echoed with the weight of authority now whispered with ghosts of things left unsaid. Gavin walked them like a man condemned, his boots striking the stone with a slow, heavy rhythm. Every room he passed seemed to hold a memory he had long buried. The cradle, untouched by affection. The study where he'd signed away warmth for duty. The nursery that once echoed with silence instead of laughter. Her words echoed in his head, relentless and sharp. You wanted a name to continue. I wanted a child to hold. The sentence struck him harder than any blade. He had believed he was protecting himself. From attachment, from loss, from the weakness his own father had shown when grief devoured him. But all he'd truly done was repeat the same cruelty. He stopped at the long window overlooking the courtyard. The sky was bruised with approaching dusk, grey clouds swallowing the sun. In the reflection, he barely recognized the man staring back, a duke with everything, and yet utterly alone. A flicker of memory intruded, his mother, her voice sharp as polished steel. You are the last of the Blackridge line, she'd said, eyes cold and proud. Do not disgrace us with sentiment. You will not love a woman. You will own one if you must, but you will never need her. He had obeyed. Even when he'd met Fiona years ago, when she had stood before him trembling but resolute, agreeing to bear a child she would never hold, he had convinced himself he was above emotion. It was a transaction, a solution. Nothing more. Now, every lie he'd told himself tasted like ash. He turned and strode toward the nursery. He needed to see his son, to say something, anything that might undo the years of distance. But when he entered, Adrien was awake, sitting on his bed, clutching a wooden horse in his small hands. The moment the boy saw him, his body stiffened. Fear flitted across his eyes like a shadow. Adrien, Gavin said softly, as though the name itself might shatter. The boy didn't answer. His hands trembled slightly around the toy. Gavin knelt, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. You don't have to be afraid of me. Adrien's lips parted, but no words came. He only shook his head, a small broken gesture that said everything. And in that instant, Gavin saw it. The years of neglect reflected in his son's silence, the fear born not from Miriam's cruelty alone, but from his own absence. He reached out, but the boy flinched. Gavin froze, his hand suspended mid-air. A hollow ache filled his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I'm sorry. The words felt foreign on his tongue. Too late. Too small. He stood, turning toward the door, his throat tight. As he stepped out, he saw Fiona in the corridor, her face pale and eyes red-rimmed from tears she had tried to hide. A bag rested at her feet. She was leaving. Where are you going? His voice came out rougher than intended. She straightened, her composure trembling under the weight of exhaustion. You don't have to worry, Your Grace. I'll be gone before nightfall. I've already arranged a carriage. Gone? His chest constricted. After everything... You said it yourself, she interrupted softly. This was deception. You owe me nothing. He took a step closer. And the boy? What of him? Her voice wavered. He'll heal, in time. No. His tone deepened, heavy with something between command and plea. He won't. Not without you. She shook her head, clutching the handle of her bag. He doesn't need me to remind him of the past. He needs you to rewrite it. The words hung in the air. Fiona's breath caught, but she didn't move. She had rehearsed this moment all day, the quiet departure, the clean break. But now, faced with his raw sincerity, she faltered. I never wanted to take him from you, she whispered. I just wanted to ease his pain. And you did, Gavin said, stepping closer still. For the first time in years, he smiled. He slept. He laughed. You did that, not I. If you go, he'll lose the only warmth he's ever known." Her throat tightened. "You speak as though that warmth comes from me alone." He shook his head slowly. "It comes from love, something this house has forgotten, something I forgot." Fiona's eyes shimmered, her grip on the bag loosening. "You can't ask me to stay after what I confessed, after what I did." "I'm not asking you to stay for me," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to stay for him." Her resolve crumbled then. She turned away, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't understand what it cost me to come back here," she whispered. "Every step through these halls reminded me of what I lost." "And what you gave," Gavin said softly. "You gave him life, Fiona. And now you're giving him peace. Don't take that away from him." She didn't move. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint patter of rain beginning anew outside the gate. Finally she looked up at him, eyes searching. "And what about you, Gavin? What is it that you want?" He hesitated. The truth trembled on his tongue, too fragile to name. "I don't know," he admitted, voice raw. "But for the first time in years, I want to learn." Her heart twisted at the sincerity in his tone. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "I'll stay for Adrien, but nothing else." He nodded slowly, though a flicker of pain crossed his face. "That's all I can ask." They stood there for a long moment, the storm whispering around them, the air thick with things neither dared say. As she turned back toward the corridor, he watched her go, every instinct in him screaming to call her back. Not as his servant, but as the woman whose courage had forced him to face the truth. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the courtyard where the fading light met the rain. The stones gleamed wet beneath his feet, reflecting his hollow reflection. He had thought power came from control. Now he saw it came from love, and he had neither. Inside, Fiona stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching her son sleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully for the first time in years. She brushed a hand through his hair, whispering a prayer of gratitude and guilt all at once. When she looked up, she saw Gavin standing in the hall beyond the half-open door. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment there was understanding, fragile but real. He inclined his head slightly, a silent vow. She turned back to the child, her voice a whisper. "I'll stay, my love, as long as you need me." Outside, thunder rumbled once more across the moors, but the sound no longer frightened the child sleeping in the Duke's house. It was no longer the sound of fear. It was the sound of reckoning, of hearts beginning at last to break open. Morning light filtered through the stained-glass windows of Blackridge Hall, fractured into shards of gold and crimson across the cold marble floor. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered. Wet air, trembling quiet, and the faint hum of tension still alive in the walls. Gavin hadn't slept. He'd spent the night pacing between the study and the nursery, each step weighed down by the echo of Fiona's confession and the look of terror in his son's eyes. Her words had split open something buried inside him, something festering and long ignored. By dawn, he made his decision. The Duke of Blackridge would no longer be haunted by the sins of silence. He would face them. He summoned the head steward, his tone calm but sharp as steel. "Bring me every record of service under my household for the past 7 years. I want reports, letters, wages, anything with Miriam's name on it." The steward hesitated only a second before bowing deeply. "Yes, Your Grace." Within the hour, a stack of ledgers, signed notes and servant rosters covered Gavin's desk. The ink was faded in places, the edges frayed, but the truth was there, buried in lines of forgotten ink. He read them all. Reports of dismissed maids, replacements who lasted only days, complaints about harsh discipline, accounts of children crying in their sleep, a pattern, a sickness. Miriam had poisoned this house long before she had ever whispered lies into Adrien's dreams. He turned to another file, one written in a different hand, a letter from the late physician, dated 4 years ago. The boy displays symptoms of fear rather than illness. The maid refuses to let me near him. His jaw tightened. He'd ignored this once, brushing it aside as trivial domestic concern. Now it burned like acid in his hands. By noon, his decision was made. The entire household gathered in the great hall, servants, guards, attendants, all lined in nervous silence. The Duke stood at the head of the room, his presence cold and commanding. Miriam was brought forward, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin smile that wavered when she saw his expression. "Do you know why I've summoned you?" Gavin's voice was low, steady. She bowed her head slightly. "No, Your Grace." "You've been in my service for nearly a decade," he continued, "trusted with my household, entrusted with my son." Murmurs rippled through the room. He lifted the physician's letter. "Do you deny restricting access to Adrien's medical care, or spreading lies that drove out every maid who dared show him kindness?" Miriam's face stiffened. "I did what was best for the child." "For the child," Gavin repeated, voice like a lash. "Or for yourself?" Her composure faltered. The room grew still. "You told my son that I despised him," Gavin said, taking a step closer. "You made him believe his mother sold him for gold, and last night he dreamt of those very words. Tell me, how long have you been feeding him poison?" Her eyes darted toward Fiona, who stood at the edge of the gathering, holding Adrien close against her. The silence cracked. "Because I was jealous," Miriam spat suddenly, trembling. "Because you chose another woman. I gave my life to this house, while someone else was paid to bring him into the world. You gave her everything I wanted. I wanted a child who would be an heir." Her voice rose to a shriek. "He should have been mine, my son, my heir!" Gasps filled the room. The Duke's hand clenched at his side. "Enough," he said, and the single word carried such authority that it silenced her at once. Gavin stepped closer, eyes burning with cold fury. "You betrayed a child's trust. You broke what little innocence remained in this house. You dared call yourself loyal while feeding on envy." Miriam's voice wavered now, trembling. I only wanted—" "You wanted power," he said, cutting her off, "and you thought cruelty would grant it." His gaze swept over the gathered servants. "This house has suffered enough shadows, no more." He turned to his guards. "She will leave Blackridge Hall before sundown. Her wages are forfeit. Her name will never again stain this household." Miriam fell to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, Your Grace, mercy." Fiona, holding Adrien, stepped forward instinctively, positioning herself between the boy and the fallen woman. Her body trembled, but her voice was steady. "He mustn't see this," she whispered to Gavin. He looked at her, truly looked, and nodded once. "Take him upstairs. He's seen enough pain." As she guided Adrien from the hall, the boy buried his face in her shoulder. Gavin watched them go, something inside him twisting painfully at the sight. Mother and child reunited not by blood's legality, but by love's truth. The guards dragged Miriam away. Her sobs echoed faintly, but Gavin didn't look back. When the doors closed and the hall emptied, silence fell heavy as stone. He remained standing, his hands gripping the edge of the table until the tremor in them subsided. Fiona returned minutes later, quiet as breath. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "He's asleep," she said softly. "Good," Gavin murmured. "He deserves rest." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "You did what had to be done." He gave a small, bitter laugh. "What had to be done should have been done years ago." Fiona shook her head. "You can't change the past." "No," he agreed, looking at her. "But perhaps I can change what remains of the future." She studied him for a long moment, her expression gentling. "That's all anyone can do." He swallowed, voice low. "Fiona, I failed you both. I see that now." Her lips parted, surprise flickering across her face. She had never heard him speak like this, without armor, without the cold weight of authority. "I let my pride become a shield," he continued. "A shield that hurt everyone around me. I told myself it was strength, but it was fear. Fear of loss, fear of feeling. She looked away, eyes glistening. And now? He exhaled slowly. Now I see that love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes the pain bearable. Fiona's throat tightened. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the faint hum of the rain against the glass filled the silence. Then, quietly, she said, "You can't ask forgiveness, Gavin. Not yet." He nodded. "I'm not asking. I just want the chance to earn it." Something fragile passed between them, like the first hint of spring thaw after a long winter, a slow, uncertain warmth. Fiona lowered her gaze, voice trembling. "For Adrien's sake, then. We'll start anew." He gave a faint, grateful smile. "For Adrien's sake." Outside, the rain began to lift, the clouds breaking apart to reveal a pale sun glinting over the moors. Light streamed through the windows once more, soft and uncertain, but undeniably there, like hope daring to return to the halls of Blackridge. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew this was the first step towards something neither had believed possible. Forgiveness, not as a gift, but as a choice. The days that followed unfolded like dawn after a long winter. Quiet, uncertain, yet softly full of light. The heavy silence that had once ruled the halls of Blackridge began to fade, replaced by smaller sounds. The echo of laughter down a corridor, the rustle of pages turning, the creak of boots beside smaller footsteps. Peace did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, through effort, through apology, through the fragile rebuilding of something that had long been broken. Fiona spent her mornings tending to Adrien, the boy's eyes no longer dulled by fear but brightening day by day. She would find him waiting by the window, holding his little wooden horse, watching the gardens where his father now often walked. It was Gavin's way of showing presence, not command, not power, simply being there. He no longer barked orders from behind closed doors. Instead, he appeared in doorways, watching his son read by the fire, offering quiet corrections when the boy stumbled over words. Sometimes Fiona caught him lingering after, smiling faintly when Adrien wasn't looking. But though the household's rhythm softened, something heavier still lingered between Fiona and the Duke. Something unspoken, yet felt in every shared glance. She could not forget what he had done, and he could not forgive himself. It was Adrien who bridged the distance neither dared cross. One evening, as dusk draped the manor in amber light, the boy sat between them in the nursery, clutching his favourite book. "Papa?" he asked suddenly. Gavin, startled by the name, looked up from the pages. "Yes?" Adrien turned to Fiona, eyes shining with a fragile kind of hope. "Miss Fiona called me her son when she thought I was asleep. Can she be my mother, please?" The question fell like a single note in a cathedral, soft but unignorable. Fiona froze. Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized he'd heard. Gavin set the book down gently. "Adrien," he said, his tone careful, "there are things we should have told you long ago." The boy tilted his head, curious but not afraid. Fiona drew a slow breath. "What your father means is, I am not just your maid." Adrien blinked. "Then who are you?" Her hands trembled, but she didn't look away. "I am your mother." The silence stretched, thick and fragile. Adrien stared between them, his small brow furrowed as though trying to piece together years he never understood. "You mean, you're my mother? Truly?" "Yes," she whispered. "Truly. I made a mistake years ago, a terrible one. I let fear and poverty take away what love had given me, but I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." The child's lip quivered. "Didn't you want me?" The child's lip quivered. "Didn't you want me?" Fiona froze. The question pierced deeper than any accusation ever could. For a moment, she considered softening the truth, telling him a story simple enough for a child to swallow. But then she looked into his eyes too knowing, too observant for his age, and realized she couldn't. He was only 5, yes, but he carried the weight of loneliness like someone far older. He deserved honesty, not another comforting lie. She drew a slow breath and spoke gently, each word chosen like a fragile thread. I did want you, Adrien, more than anything in this world. But when I had you, I was alone and frightened. Your father offered me money to survive, and I thought that was enough. I told myself you would be cared for, that I could live without you if it meant you'd live well. But I was wrong. Her voice broke. I have lived every day wishing I had been brave enough to hold you instead of letting you go. Adrien's gaze shifted to Gavin. And you, did you know? Gavin's voice was low, roughened by shame. Yes, I knew. And I wronged you both by keeping her away. I thought I was protecting my name, but I only destroyed what truly mattered. The boy's eyes shimmered. You both hurt me. They nodded, neither defending themselves, neither excusing. Fiona whispered, and we will spend every day proving we're sorry if you'll let us. For a moment, the boy said nothing. Then, slowly, he climbed off the chair and walked toward her. She bent instinctively, expecting hesitation, but instead he threw his small arms around her neck. I forgive you, Mama. Her heart broke open. Tears poured down her cheeks as she held him close, pressing kisses into his hair, murmuring his name like a prayer. Then Adrien turned to his father. And you too, Papa. You didn't know how to love before. But now you do. The simplicity of the words undid Gavin completely. His breath caught, his composure fracturing into something raw and human. He dropped to one knee, arms wrapping around his son. Thank you, he whispered hoarsely. It was the first true forgiveness he had ever received. That night, something shifted. The walls no longer felt like barriers. The portraits of dead ancestors seemed to watch less sternly. Even the hearth, which had long burned cold, now glowed warmer. Fiona noticed the change in Gavin most of all. He no longer moved like a man haunted. He walked slower, spoke softer. Sometimes he even laughed, quietly, as though still learning how. He began reading to Adrien before bed. Long after the boy had fallen asleep, he'd stay beside the fire, tracing the child's hair with unsteady fingers, memorizing every breath. Fiona would watch from the doorway unseen, her heart torn between joy and sorrow. This was the man she had once feared, a stranger capable of cruelty, and yet here he was, undone by love. Days turned to weeks, and routine became something sacred again. Gavin joined them on morning walks through the orchard. He asked questions he'd never bothered to before, about what Adrien dreamed of, what he wanted to learn, who he wished to become, and every time Fiona watched, waiting for the mask to slip. It never did. He was changing, not as a duke, but as a man. One evening, after Adrien had fallen asleep by the hearth, Gavin approached her quietly. The firelight painted gold across his face, softening his features. He stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, yet not so near as to frighten her. Fiona, he said softly, his voice trembling just slightly. I've been rehearsing words all day, but none seem right. She looked up. Then don't rehearse. He gave a quiet, unsteady laugh. Very well. He glanced toward the sleeping boy, then back to her. You taught me how to feel, not as a duke bound by duty, not even as a father desperate for redemption, but as a man, one who's learning what it means to love. Her breath caught. He took another small step closer, his eyes full of regret and gratitude all at once. You brought warmth into a house that had forgotten light. You taught me to hold my son instead of command him, to listen instead of judge. You did what I could not. Tears filled her eyes. You make it sound easy. It wasn't, he said, voice breaking. You just made it possible. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She wanted to hate him, to remember every cold letter, every lonely night. But the sight of him like this, stripped of pride and trembling with truth, dissolved what resentment remained. Her tears fell freely then, not from sadness, but release. Years of pain, of guilt, of separation, melting into the quiet firelight. He reached for her hand hesitantly, almost asking permission. She didn't pull away. Together, they looked down at Adrien sleeping soundly between them, his small hand resting over both of theirs. A bridge of flesh and forgiveness. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the night wind carried the scent of spring. New beginnings, fragile and full of promise. Neither spoke again. There was no need. Because in that moment, love, long lost, long denied, finally found its way home. The winter that once lingered over Castle Blackridge finally yielded to spring. What was once a fortress of silence now pulsed with quiet joy. Laughter spilling down long corridors that had known only echoes, warmth seeping through windows once sealed against affection. The servants, who used to move like shadows, now spoke in soft, cheerful tones. The Duke's son was no longer the frightened boy hiding behind curtains. Adrien now chased sunlight through the gardens, cheeks flushed, laughter bright as the bells from the distant chapel tower. Fiona stood in the garden that afternoon, watching him run among the tulips she'd planted with him weeks before. Her gown brushed the grass as she bent to fix his collar, smiling at the sight of his little boots muddied again. "You'll ruin your shoes before supper," she teased gently. Adrien grinned, all dimples and innocence. "You'll fix them, won't you, Mama?" She froze, the word Mama falling like sunlight through her heart. It was no longer whispered, no longer a question. It was trust made real. Gavin watched from the balcony above, no longer the cold sentinel of his past life, but a man reborn through the quiet persistence of love. The sight of them together softened his every edge. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile without restraint. That evening, he sought her out. The glow of dusk painted the halls golden as he approached the study where Fiona read by lamplight, her hair catching the light like spun honey. He paused at the doorway, a familiar nervousness beneath his calm. "Fiona," he said quietly. She looked up, her expression curious. "Your Grace?" He exhaled. "I wish you'd stop calling me that." She blinked, uncertain. "Then what should I call you?" He stepped closer. "Gavin. Just Gavin." The air between them shifted, a silence full of meaning. His hand brushed the polished wood of the desk as though grounding himself before he spoke again. "I have spent my life commanding armies, building estates, and guarding my heart. I thought power could replace peace. But peace came not through walls or wealth. It came through you." Fiona's lips parted, breath catching as he continued. "I told myself I asked you to stay back for Adrien, but I was lying. To myself most of all. Every day I saw you with him, I saw the life I could have had if I'd known how to love sooner. You have given me something no title ever could. A home." Her eyes filled, trembling between disbelief and wonder. He took a step closer. "I don't ask this as a duke. I ask it as a man who has finally learned humility. Fiona, will you stay by my side? Not as a maid, not as the mother of my son, but as my duchess, my heart's companion." For a long moment, Fiona couldn't speak. Memories flickered, the nights of loneliness, the ache of being unseen, the dream of a life that could never be. Yet here he was, the man who once bought her silence, now asking for her heart. She looked into his eyes, no longer cold marble, but alive with quiet warmth. "I never thought I'd see the day the Duke of Blackridge would say such words." He smiled faintly. "Neither did I." She stepped forward, placing her hand over his. "Then yes, I'll stay, but not because you command it, because I choose it." He bowed his head, pressing her hand to his lips. It was not the gesture of a nobleman, but of a man finally free from pride. That night, the castle glowed with celebration. The servants whispered of miracles, of how the Duke had smiled for an entire evening, how Fiona had laughed beside him, how young Adrien had danced without fear. Even the portrait-lined walls, once oppressive, seemed to breathe easier. Later, when silence fell and moonlight poured through the great hall, Gavin sat at the grand piano. His fingers brushed the keys uncertainly. It had been years since he played. Fiona entered quietly, drawn by the sound. "You play," she murmured, stepping closer. "I used to," he admitted, glancing up. "My mother taught me, but I stopped after she began demanding airs instead of songs." "Then let this be your first song again," Fiona said softly, sitting beside him. He nodded, and together they began. Her hand finding his on the keys, their melody tentative at first, then steady. A lullaby Adrien had once hummed in his sleep, one Fiona had taught him without knowing it was his father's tune. The sound filled the hall, gentle and alive, weaving the past and present into harmony. Adrien stirred awake in his bed upstairs, hearing the faint melody. He smiled sleepily, whispering to himself, "They're together now." Downstairs, the Duke of Blackridge and his Duchess played on, no longer two broken souls, but a family rediscovered through forgiveness and grace. Outside, the first snow of early winter began to fall, soft, white, and pure. And for the first time in the long, storied history of Blackridge, warmth outshone the cold. They once called him the cold Duke of Blackridge, but love, like sunlight, finds its way through every stone wall. Could love truly rebuild a broken home? Or are some wounds too deep to heal? Tell me what you believe in the comments below.